The Lime Coast, Geology of Maine's Historic Lime Industry. So if you have been around Maine for very long, been around the mid-coast, you probably have run into evidence of the lime industry that was here, even if you didn't really realize it. So as a shout out, beginning shout out to the Coastal Mountains Land Trust, one of their preserves, the Simonton Quarry Preserve, is in fact an old lime quarry. It's located just to the west of Rockport. Most of the talk that I'll give tonight has to do with the quarries farther south in Rockland, but that's just because that's where the center of the industry was. But you should definitely go and check it out. There's some good rocks there. Okay, so and in addition to the quarries like the Simonton Quarry, if you just kind of are roaming around the mid-coast, you almost certainly are going to run into evidence of the lime industry, which was really a prominent feature of the local economy for almost 200 years. So there are, the large quarries which exist. So here's one outside of Rockland there. So there's these large quarries. There are kilns around. Here is the one remaining kiln in the city of Rockland, right down on the coast. There are names on the place like Lime Rock Street in Rockland. Other places are called Lime Kiln Road and things like that. And then down here in this corner here are the very nicely preserved old lime kilns at Rockport Harbor in the marine park there. So it's easy to kind of find the evidence of this, but it's not so easy to kind of understand everything that's going on unless you know something about lime and kind of where it fits into things. So the plan for the talk tonight is to talk a little bit first about lime, what it is, how it's produced, and how it's used. And then a really short history of the mid-coast lime industry. And when I say short, that means that's my way of kind of saying that that's something I don't know a whole heck of a lot about because I'm a geologist, not a historian. I'm sure there are lots of people in the community that are considerably more expert on the nature of the history of the lime industry than I am, but I think I can give a short sketch of it just to kind of lay out how important it was and its very many different facets. And then I want to talk a little bit about the geology of it. Why is it that we have had this important industry here? So there's those kind of three big parts. So I might as well get started with the first one and talk a little about what is lime. So the lime I'm talking about is not the green kind here. Instead, it's the material lime, calcium oxide or calcium hydroxide. And this is a material that starts off as calcium carbonate. That's the mineral calcite. And you find that in limestones, in marbles, and also in shell materials. And to make lime out of calcium carbonate, out of calcite, what you do is you heat the lime. So you have you burn it, as it's called, and you heat it up. And as you heat it up, then it gets hot enough, it'll actually start to decompose and give off CO2, carbon dioxide. Then you have produced the material which is called quicklime, calcium oxide, over through here. And that's what was chiefly produced in the early days of burning lime. And then to make use of that, typically what happens is that then the lime is slaked, which means you add water back into it. So you put the water back in, and that releases heat instead of absorbing heat. The heating part here uses up a larger quantity of heat, but then when you slake it and combine it back with the water, then it releases heat, and it releases almost 90% of the heat that you put in the, quote, burning of it gets released back. So it's an endothermic reaction to heat it up to burn the lime, and an exothermic reaction releasing heat when it gets slaked. The slaked lime then is typically used to create a lime putty. And then once that's exposed to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide recombines with the lime, the water evaporates off, and it basically produces fine-grained calcite, which if you want to, for example, mortar a wall and have something which is going to hold up, that reprecipitation of the calcite as part of this lime cycle is what produces the hardening, which makes the lime work. Okay, so the important things here is that burning involves this addition of heat, and then the slaking involves a release of heat. Okay, now to do that, then you have to have the lime to start with, and that means you're going to have to quarry it out. So on the left here, that photograph is a historic lime quarry. This one's in the Rockland area. You can see a team of horses bringing the stuff out through here. Modern lime quarries are much larger, of course, and then here you can notice that these are kind of flat-lying layers of limestone which have been quarried, and then you can, once you've quarried it out, then you can ship it off and have it burned to produce the lime. So when you produce the lime or burn it, typically you do that in a kiln. Now, kilns run the gamut from the simplest up to the very, very complicated things. So initially, probably back into prehistory, lime was just burned in what were called pit kilns. And so kind of an example of that is over here. And all you do there is you take chunks of limestone that you've quarried out and you pile it in with a bunch of fuel. In most cases, in the early days, it would have been wood. And then you set the thing on fire and you just keep the fire going for days until all of the limestone gets converted from calcium carbonate into quicklime. It takes about, in order to do that, you have to heat the material up to about 1,000 degrees centigrade, about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the process, then it releases carbon dioxide. Now, doing it with a pit kiln is not very efficient. It takes a long time. And so over the years, then people developed a whole series of technologies to produce lime. So in the middle here is a diagram of what was called a perpetual lime kiln. And this one was down at the state prison in south of Waldoboro and in Thomastown. And what happened here is that it was basically a large chimney-like structure, and you layer in fuel and limestone in this big chimney. You set the thing on fire, and as it burns, then the lime the limestone gets converted to lime and basically falls down towards the bottom, and you keep adding in new fuel and new limestone at the top, and then occasionally then you can tap into the lime which has been produced down at the bottom, down in here. Over on the right is a modern kiln, cement kiln. A lime kiln will look the same way, in which you have a large rotating drum which carries material up into a progressively hotter zone and basically burns it that way. And then the whole thing is automated. You can produce immense amounts of material relatively quickly in that way. So, but the basic process is that you're heating the material up, you're producing quicklime, calcium oxide, releasing carbon dioxide gas. Now, once you've burned the lime, then the next step is, in making use of it, is to slake the lime. And slaking means you put it in the presence of water, and it starts to absorb some of the water, chemically react with it, and produces calcium hydroxide. Now, that process then, as I mentioned in that earlier lime cycle thing, is a strongly exothermic reaction. And so in the process of doing that, a big part of the heat that you put into and burning the lime actually is re-released now as heat during the slaking process. Prior to about 1900, production of lime meant that you were actually producing quicklime, calcium oxide, and that quicklime would get stored in wooden casks, and then it would be transported and slaked on the site. And slaking it meant digging a large pit, for example, and combining it with water so it would produce this lime putty. After about 1900, chemical engineering types of processes started to come on board, which allowed the lime to be combined. I typically think they used steam with exactly the amount of water that they needed to produce calcium hydroxide, which itself is a whitish powder. And the powder then could be bagged and transported. And then later, if they wanted to make a lime putty out of it, they would just combine it with water. And the difference between these two then is when the slaking of the lime takes place. And the advantage of doing it, of working with calcium hydroxide, is that you avoid this big loss of heat, which is produced when the lime is slaked. So that's done in a controlled fashion rather than an uncontrolled fashion. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways in which that uncontrolled slaking led to difficulties. So once you've produced it, then what do you do with lime? Well, lime is a really useful industrial material. It's used in a whole variety of different types of materials. So slaked lime is used as lime putty. If you then combine it with sand, you get mortar. If you combine it with very fine sand and some other materials, like, for example, a little bit of powdered gypsum, you can make plaster out of it for the building trades. Most of Maine's lime was in fact used for mortar and plaster. It was highly prized for plaster in particular. Lime is also used as a component in cement. Cement differs from regular lime in the sense that the lime what we're talking about here in the mortar and plaster is a lime mortar, which requires exposure to air to set. Whereas cement is a different type of material. It has a different chemistry to it. I'll show you an example of it in a minute, but it will basically set underwater. But so we still use large amounts of lime as a component in cement mixes. An interesting aspect of lime is that it also has this property called thermoluminescence. And when you heat it up, it emits a very bright whitish light. And in the 1800s, lime was actually used together with gas jets. The gas jets would actually heat the cylinders of lime up. The lime would start to thermoluminesce and produce this brilliant white light. And then that was the limelight that was used in theater lighting. And so our phrase of being in the limelight basically goes back to that use of lime, being in in effect, the spotlight produced by this heated lime. Lime's also used in steel making. It can remove impurities from steel, molten steel like phosphorus and sulfur. It's a very caustic material, and so it's also used in brewing and pickling. It's used in paper making. It's used as a chemical feedstock to produce all kinds of materials like, for example, acetylene gas, pollution control, the sulfur removal that takes place in smokestacks. A lot of that has to do with recombining the sulfur with calcium oxide to produce a calcium sulfate to remove the sulfur from those gases. And then the one that I don't have on here is that lime has also been used as a chemical weapon. In fact, going back to medieval time, when lime would be dumped over the ramparts of a castle under siege and dumped onto the soldiers trying to kind of take the castle, because of its caustic nature, it would cause burns and, in effect, kind of like the effect of tear gas. But for the lime that was produced here in Maine, then its chief use was in lime mortar. And so this picture is showing a piece of a cobblestone building. I used to spent 30-some years living in the Finger Lakes of upstate New York, and one of their kind of regional architectures there is cobblestone construction, where you have these buildings which are constructed out of rounded glacial cobbles. So there are these nicely rounded stones through here, which are held in with a matrix of lime mortar when they were originally done. And the lime mortar was used in these buildings because lime mortar has greater plasticity and working time. So when you're going to do all this fine joint work, such as you see back through here, then it allowed for that to happen. And it has a very warm color and texture to it. And a typical lime mortar has in it, you can see these white spots here and up here and kind of over through here. Those are chunks of lime that didn't completely go into the putty state. So those are bits of quicklime which then get translated into the mortar. But that tends to give the mortar a nice kind of warm color and texture. Now, you can contrast that with our modern Portland cement mortars. And so in this wall, there was a Portland cement repair, and this gray colored material that has this kind of dull gray color that you see down through here, that's all Portland cement mortar. And Portland cement mortar is different. It's based on this different chemistry. You take lime and you combine it with very carefully controlled rate amounts of clay and other silicate materials. And the silicate materials then go through a different chemistry, but that allows them to set even underwater. And so there's a tremendous advantage for that in terms of if you want to build things like dams and stuff like that. And these mortars tend to be much more rigid, but they set more rapidly. They have this kind of very cool gray color and uniform texture. And so, and they don't have the elasticity that lime mortars do. So when they're combined with lime mortars, they oftentimes don't play well with them. And so you can see some cracking, which is going on here right at this joint through here. So a big part of the lime that was produced in Maine was used for lime mortar. You combine the lime together with sand and create a mortar mix. It was used for doing things like bricklaying. And then the other big use for it was in plaster. And we don't have a lot of plaster construction anymore. It still exists, but not in the volume that it used to. And so, the basic idea behind a plaster construction was you started with, a plaster lath construction, and then there would be a scratch coat of plaster. It might have horsehair and those types of things, a brown coat that would have a little bit coarser material in it that was applied, and then finally a finished white coat. And apparently the Maine lime was especially good for this kind of white finish coat. So it was highly prized for that. Excuse me. And then the other nice thing about plaster is it can be molded into very complicated shapes. So you get some beautiful plaster work showing up over here. And then plaster can also be painted while it's still wet, and that gives you frescoes. And so we have a little kind of view of the Sistine Chapel down below. Okay, so it's a material which has a wide variety of uses. Most of the Maine lime was in fact though used for building purposes, for mortar, for brick and stone mortar, and for plaster. Now, in terms of the history of the Midcoast lime industry, it starts back in colonial times. In 1733, we have records showing that Samuel Waldo of Waldo County fame built a kiln, burned lime, and shipped some of it to Boston. And the industry grew from there, starting off initially being like farmers doing pit kilns in their backyards in the winter and burning lime. But by 1823, that had grown to a significant industry. They had the first shipments of Maine lime to New York City. And by 1850, the city of Rockland had 136 lime kilns operating 24 hours a day. All the kilns were basically surrounding the harbor where they would burn the lime then, and then it would be taken by ship to all up and down the East Coast. By 1870, Rockland was producing more than 1 million barrels of lime per year and 400 shiploads of that going to New York City, its biggest customer. So through the 1800s, lime production grew from being kind of a thing that farmers would do in their backfield and off season to being a major integrated industry that involved the quarrying of the lime, the production of the lime through, you would haul the lime in and burn it. You had to provide kiln fuels. You needed barrel making in order to kind of provide the containers to ship it out. You needed shipping, both shipbuilding and the shipping process itself, and you needed material being brought in by ship to support fuel for the kilns, and you needed purpose-built ships to carry the material away, and eventually railroads to kind of support the production. So all of that developed into this integrated industry. So here's some photographs kind of showing some of that. And so on the left here is one of the lime quarries that was in the Rockport area. I'm not sure exactly which one. And you can see it's basically a big hole in the ground with a haulage way that comes up through here like that, and some horse-drawn wagons back up through here. And then over here is one of the lime quarries, which was up along the Old County Road in Rockland. And these things were huge quarries reaching depths of nearly 300 feet in some cases, with nearly vertical walls. And if you've kind of driven around up through there, then you've probably seen these great big gashes. So the lime had to be quarried out from the ground. And in the area around Rockland, there were dozens of quarries. And so this is a map from a 1905 report by the U.S. Geological Survey on um, lime production it's from the Rockland Folio, and it's talking about lime production in Rockland and Thomaston. And these kind of brownish areas through here is where I've just gone by with a highlighter to show where the lime quarries were at that time. And they extend all the way from Thomaston down here, where the state prison was. The state prison actually operated a lime quarry down through there. And then in the two belts, one that kind of comes up through here to Chickasaw, I hope I'm saying that right, lake up through here, and then another belt that kind of comes down through here and includes a couple of chunks over through here. So there were lots and lots of quarries through here. The lime would be extracted from those quarries. So they would mine it out, and then I'm sorry, something just happened there. So they would, so there's the map. They would quarry it out. Then you would have to haul it to the place where it was going to be burned. And so here's some photos of hauling it in horse-drawn wagons. The idea at the quarries was to produce the lime, to quarry the limestone out in kind of head-shaped, head-sized pieces of rock. And initially they were carried to the kiln site by wagons. Later there was a railroad built, the Lime Rock Railroad was built in order to carry material down to the quarries or down to the kilns. Then you had to burn the lime in the kilns, as we said, and there was quite a technological development of kilns over time. An early kiln would be like this one. This is the only remaining kiln here left in Rockland. It's down by the harbor. And it was of a very simple design, kind of one of these perpetual kilns where you would just layer in the material and pull the material out at the bottom. But there was a lot of technological experimentation with these types of kilns, and they went from being places where you mix the fuel and the limestone together to much more sophisticated types of kilns where the lime would be in the center kind of cavity of the kiln, kind of up through here, and then there would be basically a large furnace down through here, and heat would be created through there and go up along the flue, but you would keep the limestone separate from the fuel itself. And so that became, those became known as patent kilns. Here's a view of those types of kilns at the Rockport Harbor, taken from 1890. And then today you can see the lower parts of those kilns still preserved in that nice park right at the Marine Park in Rockport. So you would burn the lime. You had, because the quicklime was produced so much heat when it was slaked, after you produced the lime, it was very important to put it in a watertight container. And so there was a significant barrel making industry that went together with the lime industry. And initially farmers would make barrels. And so here's a hay rick being driven into Rockland from Hope, carrying a whole number of empty barrels to be filled in with lime once they get to the kilns along the Rockland Harbor. And then later, the actual mechanization of barrel making to produce large numbers of barrels where you could ship the lime out. And then, of course, shipping was extremely important. One of the reasons why Maine could have such a big industry in lime was that it could be transported relatively easily to market, and that was done largely by ship. And so there were purpose-built schooners that were built to carry the lime to the market, purpose-built in the sense that they had to be relatively watertight, so they had to be in good shape. There were also a set of ships that were employed to bring fuel into the kilns. Initially that would have been kiln wood. Later that would be coal and even oil. And then late in the history, as they started to produce hydrated lime that didn't require slaking, the material could be shipped out on barges. And then the transport there also involved, as I said earlier, the building of railroads to carry lime. And so over here is a little map of Rockland and showing the route of the Lime Rock Railroad, basically surrounding the um, city, excuse me, the city and the quarries up through here, and then it could carry lime to the kilns both here, and there were more kilns back down through here. Um, so shipping and shipbuilding was an important part of it. And one of the more exciting aspects of shipping lime was that because of that strong exothermic release of energy, if lime, when the quick lime combined with the water, fire was a constant threat for shipping of lime. So, you know, you've got this wooden vessel and you've got wooden um, casks or barrels filled with quicklime. And if something happens and the water starts to leak into the barrels, then you can produce sufficient heat that it actually will set the barrels or the surrounding timbers of the ship on fire. And so there are dozens of reports of ships, lime ships coming out of Rockland, which run into this problem where the lime gets wet and they basically are set alight by this. So the photograph that's shown here is of the ship, the Bertha E. Glover, which is out of Rockland, and in 1898 managed to make it to Martha's Vineyard after it sprung a leak. The lime got into the quicklime and then basically set off enough heat to set the ship alight, and the ship was eventually lost. They did manage to get into the harbor. And then these other kind of bits across here are various New York Times articles describing schooners from that period which would run into trouble because their cargo would start to get wet, and leaking would cause these lime fires that were, and if you have a lime fire in the hold of your boat, you can't exactly try to put it out with more water because that was the problem to begin with. So a major kind of difficulty there. All right, so regardless of the fact that it had developed this broad integrated industry, there by 1900 it was starting to kind of fade out a little bit, and the writing was on the wall for Rockland lime producers, and so in 1900 there was a major consolidation of producers both in Rockland and Rockport, and this was the creation of the Rockland Rockport Lime Company. And they continued to try to innovate in order to lower the cost of their lime. But meanwhile, the lime quarries were getting deeper and deeper. It was more and more expensive to kind of get the material out. They had invested in hydrated lime production by 1903, and in 1905, it was still a major industry with 19 active quarries and about 1.8 million casks of lime going out of Rockland. But in 1916, U.S. Gypsums introduced a new building material called sheetrock, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And between the production of sheetrock and the labor savings involved in that, together with the increasing cost of producing Maine lime as the quarries got deeper and deeper and the high-grade veins of limestone started to kind of peter out, then that really started to spell the end of Rockland's lime industry. By 1958 was when the last lime was produced in Rockland. And so pretty much by 1958, that was the end of that long history of lime production. Okay, now, so the picture I try to paint there is that lime was an important resource and was really a large integrated industry that really fueled a big part of the economy of the Midcoast area for a long, long time. All right, so now the question is, well, okay, what is it about Rockland and that area? Why is it that this is where that lime industry developed? And here's where the geology really becomes critical, because the industry developed here because the limestone was there. It's actually marble, not limestone, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. And so it raises several questions. How do limestone and marble form? So we can, if we want to understand why this industry developed here, we need to know something about that. And then how did it actually get here? As you'll see, it didn't form here, but came from someplace else and was transported here. And then why is it so localized? Why are these veins that produce these unusual, the lime quarries in Maine are these kind of deep slot-like, um, almost canyons, which look unlike the lime quarries in just about any other place in the world. So let's talk a little bit about limestone. So limestone, as a geologist, I can say limestone is a biogenic chemical sedimentary rock. So let's unpack that for a minute. So sedimentary rocks are one of the three major types of rocks, the other two being igneous and metamorphic, fire formed, and one's created by heat. Sedimentary rocks are the products of surface weathering processes that break down pre-existing rocks. That material which is broken down then later gets transported someplace, deposited there, and becomes new sets of sedimentary rocks. And in order to break those rocks down, you have to have these weathering processes. Weathering comes in two different forms, mechanical and chemical. Mechanical weathering you can think about as the fragmentation of rocks, and it produces discrete particles, things like gravel, sand, silt, clay. If you go out to a stream and you grab a bucket of water and let it set, you will find that little particles will shift to the bottom. That's those mechanically weathered fragments of rock being carried away by the stream and mechanical weathering. If you were to then just kind of filter off just the water and set it aside and let it evaporate, you would discover that there is also material which is being carried in solution there. So material which has been dissolved by surface water and gets transported in solution. So a good example of that would be like, for example, sea salt, right? Salt water, you can get a sample of seawater, and if you put it in a jar on your windowsill and let it evaporate, you'll discover that it has salt in it. The salt will be reprecipitated out of it, and that's the dissolved load or the chemical result of chemical weathering. So we classify sedimentary rocks into these two broad classes: clastic, that are produced by that mechanical weathering, and chemical sediments that are a result of the chemical reprecipitation of that dissolved material. And the chemical reprecipitation can be greatly enhanced by the processes of organisms, things like algae, corals, bivalves, which can actually help to reprecipitate that material. So think about, for example, seashells. And the material to grow seashells is basically being taken out of the dissolved load in the water and being reprecipitated. And so limestone is an example of a biogenic chemical sedimentary rock, one produced by these chemical weathering processes aided by organisms which help to precipitate calcite, the carbonate, which is going to be the raw material that we're going to make lime from. Okay, so where would you go to find limestone? Well, a good example of a limestone factory is in the Bahamas, or you could go to any other kind of tropical ocean, So imagine these kind of really clear, warm, turquoisey waters, right? Kind of things that you would see on a travel commercial in the middle of the winter, right? Those are great places. In order to get good carbonate calcite precipitation, you want warm water. Turns out that calcite is less soluble in warm water than it is in cold water. So you want warm water, shallow water. The shallow water and clear water, those two things help the organisms which are going to aid in the reprecipitation of that dissolved material and produce lots and lots of nice calcite. And so here in this example, we see some little islands up through here, but all of that area all of this area through here, these are big sets of carbonate calcite sands, which are being precipitated out. So later, that material, if it gets buried, and can then become limestones. Now, in order to have those conditions, that only takes place in certain parts of the world. And in fact, you really need to be at latitudes, north or south latitudes of less than 30 degrees. So this map is showing the areas of major carbonate production, either as reefs or shelf carbonates. We won't worry about the distinctions between those two, but just notice that they're all clustered basically right along the equator where you get those warm waters. And so that's where limestones form. And as they form, then typical limestones then are created as layers of material. This is a limestone quarry in Maxville, Ohio, the Maxville limestone. And this layer right there, that's the limestone that has been precipitated. Later, other sediments have formed on top of it, and they're mining out that limestone through there. But notice that it's this nice flat layer. Okay, now here in Maine, we have a very different situation with the limestones that are being mined through here. So here's a historic photo of one of the Rockland quarries through here. And I just point out that it's a great big long gash in the ground, right? And if you look right over through here, you can see some of the layering and the adjacent rocks, and it's basically standing right on end almost. And then this is over on this side. This is an early aerial photograph of some of the lime quarries. And you can see these discontinuous long gashes as they've dug out through there, and they're going after the limestone in these long vein-like kind of patterns. So we start off with limestone, which we expect to be these flat-lying layers of sediment. But here in Maine, we get something very, very different. Not only do they have a different orientation, but ours are not limestone really, but marble. And the difference between those two is that marble starts off as limestone, typically a gray, fine-grained rock, very, very fine-grained, uniform texture, such as this piece right over through here. And then when it's heated up, it recrystallizes and becomes much coarser grain. And the main lime comes out of these types of materials through here. It's hard to see here, but this is a much coarser grained type of material, but it's basically recrystallized limestone producing marble. All right. So in order to get these limestones from some tropical regime and then have them tilted so they're on end and metamorphosed so that they're marbles instead of limestones, then we need to call upon some tectonic activity, some mountain building activity. And so here's a plate tectonic map showing the major tectonic plates of the Earth. So these are the big pieces of, relatively thin pieces of crustal material, and they shift around over time, as you probably know. And when they interact, then you can get areas of mountain building and the migration of large pieces of the crust. So this is relevant for Maine because the history of the coastal Maine is kind of sketched out in this series of cartoons here. So Maine started off with a coastline that was farther to the west. So this is back 470 million years ago. And there was an ocean basin off to the east as there is now, but it was a different ocean basin. And initially there was a small fragment of crust, what we call an island arc out through there, that came in, docked with Maine in about 470 million years ago, and the first of our mountain building events called a tectonic orogeny. And then there was a larger piece of continental type of material out farther in the ocean out through here called the Avalon microcontinent. And subduction, the downward warping of oceanic material started up again, and this material started to kind of slide in through here. So what happens here is that this plate moves in like this. The ocean crust here is denser, and so it can be subducted under continental materials, such as this material and this material over through here. And so the ocean basin closes, and eventually Avalon collides with North America and produces another mountain building event called the Acadian orogeny. And so this chunk of Avalon, in effect, gets plastered onto the North American continent. And that's important to us because that's how the limestones get to Maine, is they basically come in as part of Avalon and impact the North American continent and get stuck on over through here. To complete the Appalachian history, later even another continental fragment comes in, this time the Alleghenian orogeny, as Africa collides with North America. They create the supercontinent Pangaea. And then 260 million years ago, the whole thing starts to reverse and the modern Atlantic starts to form with the rifting of parts of that um, the African continent away now from North America, producing the modern Atlantic coast that we see through here. But even though this material now has been carried away, there is a fragment of this Avalon plate material left on the North American coast. So, so how did these deposits from a latitude of less than 30 degrees get to Maine where our latitude is 44 degrees? They came in as part of that tectonic activity. How were they metamorphosed to marble? Well, through that collisional process in the burial, then materials get heated up and the limestone was metamorphosed to marble. Why are they elongate near vertical lenses? Well, that was part of the deformation that happened during that squeezing event, the collision that produces the Avalon plate. So somehow I skipped over one thing here. So here's a little uh, video which will give you an idea of what happens during one of these collision experiments. So this is done with analog materials. And what we're going to see is that here's an old ocean floor here, which is going to be subducting like this down under this continental plate here. And we can imagine that our limestones, which are going to become part of the Maine's lime industry, are going to be in that little kind of basin right in through here. So I'm getting the thing going here. And what happens is that as this starts to collide, then because this material can't be subducted down, pushed down that subduction down, it gets scraped up and it starts to produce a large series of folds and faults, which are forming right in through there. And just kind of watch that for a minute. You can see it's being buckled up and produces this large welt of material through here. There it is through there. And as it says down there, we see similar structures in rocks in mountains. Well, so what do we see here? Well, these rocks have been stacked up on top of each other. So that increases the amount of pressure, increases the temperature, and it also means that then they can have the chance to metamorphose. So if we now, instead of looking at that little cartoon, look at the geologic map of Maine, we see that here's Rockland right down through here. And this chunk of material that you see kind of right up through here, that's our fragment of Avalon, which has been pushed up onto the North American continent. And this diagram down here is showing you a cross section of what we think those rocks actually look like in terms of cross-sectional view. So this is the current erosional surface running around, right along through here. And these large kind of folds and big thrust faults, as they're called, which bring material up out of that collapsing ocean basin onto the North American continent, looks just like the stuff we saw in that little video. And if we zoom in on this portion right through here, that's showing where the cross section is, our limestones, which make up most of the Rockland belt, come out of this circled area right through here. And what we see here is that these have been pushed up and folded and now have these really steep orientations to them. And so that's why they kind of exist in those elongate belts and have these kind of steep forms of the quarries and these kind of long gouge-like features that look like that. So with that, I think I am pretty well done. I want to say, let me leave that. Thanks to several folks. First of all, thanks to the Coastal Mountains Land Trust for allowing me to do these kind of talks. Thanks to the Camden Public Library and the expert help of Julia, and also to folks there who helped with some of the photos. And then lastly, I have to thank my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, Mary Blakesley and Laszlo Bach, whose house I'm sitting in right now as I give this, because my wife and I are just getting back from a long trip and we needed someplace with a reliable internet
Well, thank
connection.
you so much, folks. That was excellent. I think last time you did a talk for us, I immediately told everyone they had to grab their #2 pencil and get ready for their test.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was excellent. And I took as many notes as I could. But we have already some questions coming in into
Great.
the Q&A box, and also a few notes that have been put into the chat box. I wanted to actually first start out with Judith, who mentioned that for a history of the lime industry, check out Quarry and Kilns Story of Maine's Lime Industry by Roger Grindle. So there you go, folks, if you're looking for a good resource.
Just on that token, when Julia posts the recording of this, I wrote up an annotated set of references for these things, and you'll be able to download that as a PDF, and that book is on there together with several other things.
Absolutely. That'll be located again on the YouTube channel, Camden Public Library's YouTube channel. Okay, let's jump into some of these questions. Let me go down here. So we have Dwight, who says Lincolnville limestone deposits are whiter and less dense than Rockland deposits and produce a finer plaster. Was it deposited at a different time? When was Lincolnville limestone deposited?
It may have been deposited at a slightly different time. The structure of these big sheets that were thrusted in is very hard to unravel. It made even harder by the fact that stuff has been metamorphosed. But the lime comes in several different, in addition to the calcium carbonate type of lime, there's also a calcium magnesium carbonate lime, and sometimes the two are mixed together. And it just may be that those were particularly pure beds of that material. So I know that the deposits which are richer in the calcite ones were the ones that were most favored for plaster production, and the ones that had more of the magnesium material in it would be more typically used for things like brick mortar and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And Dwight had another part to his question. He says the Lincolnville limestone deposits are adjacent to Granite Pluton. Which came first, the Pluton or the limestone, and what are the ages of each deposit?
Oh, excellent question. Yep. So the limestones come first, and the Plutons come later. So these limestones it's difficult to date them because of their metamorphism. Usually sedimentary rocks are dated on the basis of the fossils they contain. None of these limestones contain significant fossils that we know of, or at least have been discovered yet. And so and the fact that they're kind of squeezed together in all these different sheets makes them very difficult to date. But we think that they're probably, on the basis of their general nature and where they sit, that they're probably Cambrian to Ordovician. So maybe like 500 million years old, something like that.
Wow.
The granites come in later at like 420 million years. You can see in places like around the last talk I did for the Fernald's Neck, you can actually see where the granite has intruded into those rocks. The granite itself is undeformed, so it's not been affected by this squeezing. It came in after the mountain building event, late in it, and so the granites are later.
Okay, well, that sort of ties into David's question. He wanted to know, and I'm not exactly sure what direction to go with this, but he wanted to know, is there a relationship between the limestone quarries and the granite quarries in the coastal area? So were they being quarried together at the same time?
No. So the limestone, they do overlap in terms of time, but they're very different in terms of the geology. All of the granites come in later. They're generally undeformed, so they're late relative to that whole metamorphism sequence. They probably are produced in part by the heat generated by the mountain building event itself. And it just so happens that they come in and intrude into areas where some of the limestones were also present, but there's no direct genetic link between the two.
Okay.
Before I moved to Maine, I didn't even know that there used to be a lime industry here.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I was completely clueless. started driving around Rockland, seeing all these big holes in the grounds and
Mm.
streets called lime rock. It was like, what the heck?
Hmm.
Because I just assumed that all the quarrying in Maine was granite, but that's not was not the case.
So you had actually shown us an image of a lime quarry in Ohio. And
Right.
is that about as far inland in the continent as one would find lime?
No, and um, limestones extend all the way into the mid-continent, and then
Mm.
you also find them across the west, for example, and they're very common in the Colorado Plateau and the
Oh.
walls of the Grand Canyon, places like that. But not all limes make good lime mortar. You want something that's relatively pure. Um, and they are, I probably should have said as well that that lime is still being produced in at the Dragon Cement Quarry
Mhm.
in Thomaston. And there they are mining because they are producing cement, which involves these silicates as well as the lime, then they're basically drawing from material which would not have been pure enough to make the kind of lime that we're talking about here.
We got the good stuff here, you know.
We had the good stuff, I'm
We
afraid.
had the good stuff. Well, Judy actually wanted to know, are there other Maine coastal areas that have these really nice limestone or marble deposits?
Well, not really. That it's really restricted, as far as I know, it's restricted to Rockland and then a little bit up in Rockport area, and that's about it.
Okay.
There might be some really small bodies further north, but I think there I I don't know of production from those.
Mm. Corlin, and I apologize if I didn't say your name correctly, says that she lives in Lincolnville and has been
Mhm.
researching and writing up the lime industry there.
Oh,
Um,
great.
we're at the end of the lime vein, and I wonder if you have done any work in this area.
I haven't, and none of the geology here is my own is the result of my own work. The So the Maine Geological Survey has mapped the Rockland area, the Camden area, and I don't know if they've completed the detailed map of the Lincolnville or they're working on it.
Mm.
Um, but if she is interested, she could get a hold of me and I could certainly direct her to those kind of materials. I would urge everyone to spend some time looking at the Maine Geological Survey. They have a lot of great stuff that is available to download for free, including some stuff about lime and the lime industry.
Thank you. Pat, we have so many questions coming in. I'm going to do my best to get through all of these. Pat says, how does coomb limestone become so convoluted? I'm thinking of rock forms near Rockport. So was that what you showed us in the graphic? Is that how it got all twisted up?
Yes, yes. And when if you think about that squeezing process and stuff being kind of squeezed out, limestone is relatively ductile compared to other types of rocks. And so it tends to just kind of squeeze around. It's kind of like uh, the equivalent of toothpaste. You just kind of squeeze on the stuff and it just kind of goes. And so that's one of the reasons why the lime deposits become these lenses and kind of discontinuous
Mhm.
little kind of squibs of material here and there. It's because the lime moves quite readily when it's subjected to those types of forces.
William wants to know, do you have any sense of the amount of waste materials that were created and what was done with it in the lime industry in Maine?
I don't. I don't think there was a lot of waste because they were basically, it's not like it was not the kind of thing where they were doing strip mining where you can remove all the overburden and then take material off. They would get onto one of these veins, as they call them. They really are beds, but beds of limestone, and they would just start digging down and then following along it. And when they got into the stuff that would be quote waste rock, then they would just go back and try to kind of go back into the vein proper. So I don't think they produced vast amounts of waste, kind of nothing like what you would see if you were to look at, for example, copper mines in the Western United States, where there are huge tailing piles and things like that.
Um, this sort of ties into Polly's question. She wants to know, well, how long is the lime processing cycle?
Oh, you mean how long to go all the way around that
Yeah, to
cycle
like
thing?
burn it down and to go through the
Well,
whole thing.
Hard to say. I mean, the production of the limestone itself could take a million years, right? To grow the lime when you are kind of bunches of little algae kind of secreting small amounts of calcium carbonate per
That's the
time.
hard part. Yeah. Okay.
That could be the hard part. And then quarrying, it doesn't take very long to kind of quarry out, several tons of the rock. And then the burning process, I think the lime kilns probably processing time there was like 3 or 4 days to go through that for
Oh,
most
okay.
of them, something like that to burn
Okay.
it down. And then shipping and use, not very much time. Once you slake the lime, then, it takes a period of weeks for the lime to kind of cure and fully
Mhm.
harden. And then you're back to now instead of having little organisms, the shells of little organisms, you have nice plaster walls.
And
So
Marcia wants to know, is the quicklime slaked with fresh water, salt water, or both?
I would imagine freshwater, I have not heard, I don't really know anything about the use of salt water.
Mm.
Um, I know that sometimes that they experimented with different materials to change the slaking time and the consistency of the putty, but everything I've read had to do with fresh water.
Mm. So you had mentioned that in Thomaston, they're still doing some processing of lime.
Yes.
So John wants to know, how does the Thomaston cement factory fit into the history of lime in the Rockland region?
Well, um, so they are mining in effect really in the southern extension of some of those same deposits.
Okay.
They, instead of being restricted to very narrow veins of high grade calcite, they can mine large volumes of rock, which include not only the calcite, but also other minerals, clay minerals, silicates, because they are making cement where they actually grind the stuff up, heat it up, and it creates this calcium silicate material, which then becomes Portland cement. So the Portland cement, you add the water back in, and instead of it combining with atmospheric CO2 to create new calcite, it combines with the water combines with the silicate to create calcium silicates, and that's what hardens cement versus these lime mortars.
Okay. Francis actually has a question that was the one that I had written down. What told the farmers in the 1700s that they had this resource in their fields? Is it like you just stumble upon a little bit of it and then you just dig down? How were they identifying it?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. That um, they would find a small outcrop where it come to the surface. This it's pretty recognizable when you find it because it's relatively soft compared to most of the other rocks we have in our area.
Mhm.
It's coarse grained, and if you break it open, it has this kind of white color and this kind of sparkly look to it. And so it's fairly easy to recognize. And um, lime mortars go back into antiquity. I mean, the Romans made lime mortars and stuff. So the process and the understanding of the material was certainly there. And so people would find it in their fields, I think, and just start digging a hole.
So Sylvia had asked, so why do we call it lime in Maine? Because you had mentioned that it was marble. And is it
Yes.
softer than regular marble?
Well, no, it's called that largely because the people who first started talking about it and just didn't recognize that it was actually the metamorphic equivalent, that it was a metamorphic rock. It really should be referred to as marble. It's not limestone per se. It's been altered in this way, but limestone is the transition from limestone to marble is kind of unusual in metamorphic rocks. Usually, most sedimentary rocks, when they're metamorphosed, there's not only a change in the appearance of the rock and the grain size of the rock, but the actual minerals themselves change. So in our area, we see lots and lots of garnet, and people may be familiar with the chiastolite, the andalusite, which forms as a result of some of those materials. So you typically get the growth of new minerals. But
Okay.
calcite's a little bit different in the sense that it doesn't really combine into new minerals. It just gets coarser grained. And in some cases, it kind of helps to purify it somewhat.
Okay.
And so it really was a misnomer for the start, but sometimes it's easier to just go with a misnomer rather than try to swim upstream against it.
So it's not, David's asking, it's not the same kind of marble that Michelangelo's carving out of, or that we're, building buildings out of?
Well, mineralogically, yes, it is. It's the same kind of material. It's the
Okay.
same mineral. It's coarse grained in that way, and some of it probably could have been used for those types of purposes, but there wasn't the market for it that there was for plaster.
Right. Okay. And Richard wants to know, if we drained Lake Chickawaukee, would we find a limestone deposit?
That's a great question. My guess is that probably there would be some limestone down there because all those things kind of point up to the lake there.
Mhm.
But uh, the market for lime proper is not what it used to be, and there are, Maine had big advantages in the sense that it had these really pure deposits right on the coast where it made water shipping relatively easy. Now we can ship by rail just as easily, and it can come from basically anywhere. So I
Mm.
don't think that they would be economically viable, but I'm certain that there are limestone, that there are marbles down there.
So speaking of bodies of water, I wish I would have asked this question a few questions back because it tied
Yeah.
into something else. But Anita says Rockport Beach Park and Goose River Bank in Rockport have major waste piles of white material. Are those
Oh,
from the
okay.
lime industry?
I would guess. I would guess.
Okay.
Yes.
I've always wondered what
Yeah.
that stuff was, but
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
would make sense. Goodness gracious, this is like the most questions we've ever had in a program. Brooks, you were like, why do people come to these? Because you are so fascinating. That's why.
I think it has to do, I think geology is just is very interesting, and we all happen to live in a great place to
Oh my
look at
goodness.
rocks.
Yes. And by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, Brooks did another talk about Fernald's Neck in Camden, if you're interested to hear about the geology of that particular spot. Okay, Barbara says, is the black marble around the fireplace in the local library, behind me, is the same marble used for lime?
I don't know. I probably not. The fact that it's black suggests that there's lots of impurities in it, and so it would probably not be used for that. But sharp eye, Barbara. Um,
I don't know where
extra credit for that.
and this is actually just a fake background. It's not, I'm
Yeah.
not really at the library, so I can't even go see if there's a plaque that says anything about it.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into that.
It could be anything we want.
Petra wants to know, can you talk about sinkholes, which can show up in roads and other places in Rockland? Are they related at all to the lime in our
Oh, well,
in our
I didn't
ground?
know anything about sinkholes in Rockland, but one of the classic features of areas which are underlain by limestone are sinkholes because
Mm.
it's relatively, calcite is relatively soluble. And so there are, like I currently am sitting in my sister-in-law's house looking down at a limestone creek in southern Pennsylvania. And we were just having a big discussion this morning that the banks of this creek are really steep, and we think it's probably just a series of old limestone caves that
Mm.
collapsed to create what is now this creek. So limestones, and if you are a caver at all, you probably know that most of the world's big caves are in limestones because it's relatively soluble. So anytime you have that soluble material around, then you have the potential for sinkholes where the underground water basically dissolves away the limestone until the overlying material collapses.
Yeah, I'm from Florida and it was an issue all
Oh
the
yeah,
time because of the
yeah,
limestone there.
yeah,
Absolutely. But
yeah. We
again,
have,
great diving that you could do in the
yeah.
area.
I'm,
Okay,
I'm
so
glad other people do it and not
I,
me.
yeah, not me. um, so a question came in, where was Avalon originally located?
So originally it was located seems to have been in the southern hemisphere, like 20 degrees latitude, and then as the ocean basin closed, it came northward and rotated around. Geologists can't really talk without moving their hands and things like that. But if you go on the web and you look for plate tectonic reconstructions, if you type that in and look, for example, in YouTube, you can find lots of reconstructions that'll show you the migration of the plates over time.
All
And
right.
and in the Maine Geological Survey also has some sets of drawings which will show you kind of where we think Avalon was back when these rocks would have formed 400, 500 million years ago.
Well, I know that in the Walsh History Center, the library, we probably don't have a ton of information specifically about that part of the lime industry, about lime formation in the lime industry. But I'm going to do a little plug for the Walsh History Center here because we do have tons of other resources related to the lime industry. And I know Ken Gross is going to watch this later, so he'll be happy that I did that
Ken
plug.
very kindly provided several of the photographs, and I
Yes,
think I got them got the photo credits on the photos. But
yes, thank you so much.
thank you, Ken.
Yes, and there's great resources there. So,
Yeah.
and thank you so much, Brooke. You are such a great resource, and the Coastal Mountains Land Trust is so lucky to have you as this super person who comes and gives talks, and we are lucky too at the library to have you.
Well, thank you. I enjoy doing them. I learned a lot in doing this talk, and
good.
I'm going to start thinking about the next one I'm going to try to do.
Yay, good. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you. Several people have put some interesting resources into the chat box, and I encourage you all to kind of look through those real quick. And once again, I want to remind people, if you'd like to share this program, I will be putting the recording up tomorrow, probably by the afternoon, on the Camden Public Library Programs YouTube channel with that resource list that, that Brooks mentioned earlier. Please visit coastalmountains.org and check out all the other cool outdoor programs they have coming up. Again, we're wrapping up our season of talks that have been online this year, but hopefully we'll be able to later in the year start them up again in the library. It'll be so fun to see you all in person. And please remember to check librarycamden.org, because even though this is our last one with Coastal Mountains Land Trust, I still got a lot of stuff to talk about. So we'll be doing programs, more programs on Zoom and in the amphitheater and in person coming up real soon. You can find it all on our calendar. All right, once again, have a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Brooks.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Good night.
Thank you.